Good morning, Year 5, and welcome to your English lesson today. Your learning objective is to ask a range of investigative questions. So here is what you will need today. You will need 2 to 3 pieces of paper or a notebook, a pen or pencil, your active brains, and your creative imagination. I want you to pause the video here if you need to get those things. If not, please continue. So for a warm-up activity today, we are going to be looking at modal verbs. Modal verbs are the auxiliary verbs which cannot usually work alone. They are used with a main verb. These are modal verbs. Let's look at some examples. Might, will, may, should, could, would, ought, must, shall, and can. Pause the video here and try and write down 3 sentences using a modal verb. Okay, great. So let's look at some of the missing modal verbs from the sentences below. You can pause the video here while you try to fill in the blanks. Have you done that? Excellent. Let's look at some of the modal verbs that could be missing from these sentences. You must be hot in that thick coat. If it's dry, shall we play outside? He's so fast, he should win the race. I'm fed up with my long hair, I might have it cut. Did you choose any of these modal verbs? Which others could you have used? Okay, and well done for warming up those brains. It's time to move on. This term, in DR, we're going to be reading Beowulf. This is the front page of the original manuscript. The original poem is the oldest surviving epic poem in Old English. It was written somewhere around 1975 and 1025 AD. The author is unknown. This copy can be found in the British Library here in London. Okay, so let's look at your activity today. Today, we are going to be archaeologists. We can find out a lot of information about the Anglo-Saxons by looking at archaeological evidence. It's an archaeologist's job to look at the evidence, such as artifacts and buildings from the past, and try to interpret them. Do you think you could be an archaeologist? First, let's look at some key vocabulary. To be an archaeologist, you need to learn some new words. Archaeology, for example, is the study of the lives of people in the past. In relation to our work, we are going to be looking at the Anglo-Saxons. Evidence. This information is to help support an idea or an interpretation. An artifact. An object made or changed by people. Interpret. To try and explain what something means. And evacuate. To dig up and record some archaeological remains. We have looked at archaeological remains before and artifacts last year when we done the ancient Romans. Okay, so let's have a quick game of rot or not. When we speak of rot, we often think about whether or not items would decay over a period of time. On a piece of paper, draw 2 small columns with rot and not as a heading in each, and get ready to put in the items for each column. Would food survive 1,000 years? Would it rot or would it not? How about pottery? Pottery would often be made from clay? How about fabric? And a bones or a skeleton? How about leather boots? Would they survive 1,000 years? And wood? How about metal? So let's take a look at what would rot and would not. So first, we have food. Food would indeed rot. Pottery and metal would not rot. These are more of a solid form. They may lose some of their features over time, but they would still remain intact. Wood, unfortunately, when it's damp, can begin to rot. Glass, like pottery and metal, is a solid substance. Fabric would rot, and bones would not. And of course, leather boots would as well. Fabric and leather boots, we do often sometimes see some sort of remains still on skeletons when we dig them up. Let's find some evidence from the past. Archaeologists evacuate archaeological sites to discover and record the daily life in ancient times. The photographs coming up on the next slide show artifacts from an excavation. Can you work out what any of the following artifacts are? Please make sure to write these down as you will need them later on. But first, let's look at the type of questions we should be asking. The types of questions we should be asking will link back to the modal verbs we learned earlier. So let's have a look at our W questions. Are who, where, why, when and what. For example, what artifacts can you see? Who might this have been? How should an archaeologist handle the artifacts? Okay, so let's look at the types of questions you should be asking yourself when looking at the artifacts. For example, you should be asking, what could the artifacts have been used for? Some of them look pretty peculiar. Do you think we use anything similar to it today? Another question could be, why were famous important people from ancient society often buried with treasure or possessions? You may remember from year 3 that King Tutankhamun is probably one of the most famous examples of this. When they discovered his tomb, he was buried with everything he owned. Okay, so let's move on to your activity. Today, on the next few slides, I want you to be able to write down and tell me what you think some of the following artifacts are and what they are made from. The artifacts on this page, for example, look pretty unusual, but we still use them very commonly today. What do you think they could be? Unfortunately for Aidan, I don't think these helmets will fit him this year, as these are models of the helmets used by soldiers. But do you think you can tell me which tribes they could be from? These items are commonly found in our kitchen. Can you find out what they are and what materials they are made from? I'll give you a clue. The horn isn't found on a Viking's helmet. And lastly, here are some peculiar symbols. What do you think they could be? Have we seen anything like this before? What do you think they're made of, and how do you think the inscription got there? Can you find out the meanings? So now it's time for your main and final activity. Use modal verbs to make 5 or more predictions about whose tomb this might have been. Why do you think this king was so renowned? End the video and start on your task.